Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to see you all today, and I would like to welcome you to the new semester. We have lined up a very exciting series of talks and speakers, both in our Ambassadors and Distinguished Statesmen Forum and in our lecture series, The US in World Affairs. I'm Klaus Lares, the organizer and moderator of these talks, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I would like to say quickly that once again we've had a wonderful day in Chapel Hill with lots of brilliant sunshine. I would like to thank all of our sponsors for the generous support for our events. As you know, we are videotaping our events, and they are all available on our YouTube channel, and that is youtube.com/KresnoUNC in one word. Please also feel free to sign our mailing list so that I can keep you up to date with all of our events and what is happening. Thank you again for coming today to our first talk this semester on Hitler and the Germans. Hitler's Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, almost 70 years ago. Still, books on the Nazi regime, books on Hitler and his many crimes are highly popular and sell very well indeed. And plenty of books and articles have been written on the Nazi era from 1933 to 1945. Thus, this period of time in German and international history has been very well researched. One should imagine that there is very little left to say on Hitler and the Nazi regime. This, however, is not the case at all. In fact, our speaker today will give us a new angle, a new dimension regarding how Hitler managed the German people by using coercion and also by using compromises. I'm more than pleased to welcome Professor Nathan Stoltzfus of Florida State University in Tallahassee to UNC today. Professor Stoltzfus is one of America's great experts on the Nazi era. Professor Stoltzfus is a professor of 20th century European history at Florida State University. He is the author or editor of 5 books, and among his books are Resistance of the Heart, Intermarriage and the Rosenstrasse Protest in Nazi Germany. The book was a co-winner of the Frankel Prize, and it was a New Statesman Book of the Year. It also was a prize winner of Munich's Bestenliste for non-fiction, and it has been translated into many foreign languages. Reviews of the book applaud Nathan for his remarkable detective work, and Michael Geyer of the University of Chicago writes that the Rosenstrasse protest points to the powers of non-cooperation and protest. Stoltzfus shows very convincingly how extraordinarily sensitive the Nazi leadership, especially Joseph Goebbels and Hitler, was when it came to popular opinion. Professor Stoltzfus has also published Nazi Crimes and the Law, Courageous Resistance, the Power of Ordinary People, Social Outsiders in Nazi Germany, and he also published Shades of Green, Environmental Activism Around the Globe, something slightly different. Nathan Stoltzfus received his PhD from Harvard in 1993. He was a Fulbright scholar, joined the faculty of the National Judicial College, and he has received many prestigious fellowships, too many to mention them all. His work has also formed the basis for several films. It is a great pleasure to welcome Nathan Stoltzfus to UNC today. I'm also very grateful that Professors Gerhard Weinberg and Konrad Jarausch have joined us today. Both hardly need any introduction here. Both eminent professors are among UNC's most distinguished scholars with many publications to their names. And both, of course, are experts on the Nazi period and on 20th century German and European history. After Nathan's talk, Gerhard and Konrad will help me to interrogate our speaker a little and ask him some very tough questions. And afterwards, of course, we'll welcome questions from you, the audience, and there's plenty of time for many questions. Today, Nathan Stoltzfus will talk about Hitler's management of the Germans, coercion and compromise. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Stoltzfus to UNC today.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words, Klaus. I'm always hoping that Hitler fatigue doesn't set in before my talk, and I'm pleased to see you here. Klaus mentioned how many books had been written on Hitler. I'm, of course, delighted to be here. I'm privileged to be at this distinguished forum on international relations. But the topic at hand is as was said, is the question of management of the German people. How much power did Hitler have, really? And what can we say about that based on how he managed dissent? We know that Hitler used terror. We know that the backdrop of the Third Reich was the concentration camps, the terror system. Hitler was glad to use terror to bring people in line anytime possible. However, this was not always, Hitler thought, the most effective means for achieving his ends. And so there was an element of strategy to Hitler's leadership, not just lashing out with terror whenever he met opposition. There was an attempt to manipulate the regime, of course, so the Germans, so that they did not actually dissent, of course. But if dissent did break into the open, then there was a question of how to manage this dissent. It became a question of managing the image, managing the presence of this, so that as few people as possible knew about this. After all, a major propaganda image for the Third Reich was that everybody was united under this single Führer. Now, of course, there's an element of strategy even in Hitler's charismatic leadership, and that is he had to have a succession of successes that impressed the Germans, that wowed the crowd, and certain times he performed those at certain points to help his popularity. And the whole point for Hitler was to move the people across from where they started when he met them with their Christianized traditions to a more Nazi position, a fully Nazi position, so that they acted entirely like Nazis, if possible. And my image of this is that Hitler, if you can imagine this, is a dance leader with the German people as his partner, and they're trying to get from this side of the dance floor over to that side of the dance floor. Here's the old and here's the new German Nazi order. Well, I have no idea. The point here is that that Hitler was willing to slow down. Hitler was willing to double back. If the people stumbled, if they were slow, he wanted to stay with them. So there was that's a metaphor. I have no idea whether Hitler was good on his feet. He claimed to be actually a nifty skier, which he had to give up once he became Führer, for fear that he would fall. But what we want to concentrate on today, actually, is this realpolitik, this decision by Hitler, cost-benefit calculus, that you make certain concessions in order to you move laterally for a little bit in order to move forward fully. Now, here we're looking at concessions as another side of the charismatic leadership, really, and that is, in addition to pulling the people forward with these great acts of achievement, mostly on the foreign stage, foreign relations stage, Hitler had to make sure that he stopped any signs of alienation, any signs of the people who were actually endangering the Hitler myth. So it's got two sides here, where social dissent has to be either repressed. If it's not repressed, it has to be hidden. Okay, let me start with an example of social action that was actually a street demonstration that the Nazis instigated. Now, we want to look later at demonstrations that erupted on streets initiated by the populace. I'm talking here about social dissent in the exaggerated form of rumors, extended and sustained rumors, unrest to the point of actual dissent in open on the street. And to show how important demonstrations are, that's part of it. Let me introduce an example here where the regime tries to actually oust a bishop by staging demonstrations outside of his residence. The bishop is Johannes Sproul, The year is 1938 when this happens, but the story begins in 1933, in July, when the Nazi regime enacts the compulsory sterilization law. Across the Reich, hospitals and doctors collaborate in order to now forcibly sterilize those who are diagnosed with an incurable disease, whether it's manic depression, schizophrenia, and so forth. But not in Bishop Sproul's district. Sproul, of course, has his residence on the Neckar River in Rotenburg. But his district, as I say, includes Stuttgart, where he has this hospital, the Marion Hospital. He draws a line and says, not in my hospital are you sterilizing people, because I don't believe in that. It's going on all around. And so he draws a line, and he's able to get away with it. It's only, however, the first salvo in his capacity to follow his conscience and to do what he thinks is right, despite what the regime has to say. And so over the period of the next 5 years, he builds up quite a record of what the regime considers to be treason. And not surprisingly, in January of 1938, the public prosecutor there in Stuttgart, decides to indict him. Very long, very detailed list of treasonous acts that Bishop Sproul has done. And this is brought to Berlin. The prosecutor does notice at one point that because of these acts of defiance, the bishop has become a little bit of a hero. Now this in Berlin is seen as a problem because how do you attack a hero when you're trying to, a hero's in opposition, you want to take that support and make it your own. Well, the favored tactic of the Nazis was first to isolate and then to send in the Gestapo. If you could ostracize somebody, make them an outsider, then it was easier to send in the Gestapo. But here's a hero. And 3 months later, in April 1938, the regime sees an opportunity. It seizes it. It's, of course, the Anschluss. In the wake of the Anschluss, there's triumphal roars all across Germany, up and down, ringing through the mountains there at the border of Austria and Germany. Both sides of the border are welcoming this. And it turns out, of course, that the regime cannot lose this opportunity as a propaganda opportunity and holds a plebiscite. Well, the plebiscite, of course, is overwhelmingly in favor of the Anschluss. Now, we know that they might have stolen the results from the propaganda ministry whenever they had a plebiscite. But nevertheless, you can't deny that this was enormously popular, that the bishop had stayed home instead of voting for the Anschluss, and the regime swoops in and says, now we're going to take a chance to isolate this bishop. We'll show that he's out of touch, that he's not really one of the folk. And they decide, rather than using the judicial process, to actually start demonstrations outside of his residence. And so these commence in June. They go on night after night, sometimes consecutive nights, consecutive weeks, whenever the bishop is in residence. And there are hundreds of people calling for a real German bishop. They say, go to Moscow where you belong. They say, you're treasonous. So this is supposed to build a united opinion, many people with one voice on the same page. And even though these regional officials are very careful to advise and admonish the demonstrators not to be physically violent, not to start property destruction, by July there are some rowdies, whether they're infiltrators or not. They break through the door and they rough up the bishop and even the archbishop, I believe, who's visiting him. They tear down the swastika flag from the upper floor where it's flying. They destroy property. And this is a key moment in this attempt by the regime to actually use demonstrations to shun this bishop, because it does finally lead to counter demonstrations. finally the empathy is sufficient on the side of the bishop that people who are his followers stage a counter demonstration outside of his church, greeting him when he comes out of the church. Now, what are we to make of this story? Certainly, Sproul was sent off in a Gestapo car to his friend's quarters in the Archbishop in Freiburg. But I think what Hitler learned was the people were not quite ready to take over the role of the judiciary. He still might need that prosecutor. Nazi law, was had the sense that the people embodied the law. That in Nazi law, the healthy sense of the people was law. In other words, of course, he met the people when they weren't healthy, but he was working with them to get them to be healthy enough so that they would spontaneously expel elements that were foreign, people they recognized as against them and their Volksgemeinschaft. Well, let's move then to several examples of street protests or let's just say voices of opposition by crowds, or at least masses that are moving in disregard for the regime itself and disregard of the regime's will. The first one I'd like to, there are several points here. The first point is what we've just discussed, and that is it reaches a crisis level for the dictator when there are actual opposing opinions being expressed in public. This is, of course, as I said, a problem because everybody's supposed to be on the same page according to the propaganda image, and Hitler has to come in to decide whether you repress that opposing opinion or whether you try to appease it so that it goes away quickly before a lot of people know about it and maybe people join it. The first incident illustrates that I want to talk about, and that is in 1934 in Bavaria and Württemberg in the southern rim of Germany. There are two Protestant churches that refuse to join Hitler's Reich Church, and this comes to a head in the summer of 1934. Now, when we think of the summer of 1934, it's very usual for us to think of the Night of the Long Knives. This was when Hitler proved that he could be bottomlessly ruthless against his enemies, even recent allies. Germans were put on notice that this is what could happen to you. This was the Führer. Several months later, Hitler makes a surprising, or at least a notable, compromise, which is what I'm talking about today. And the context of this is that Hitler, before he comes to power, sees that the Protestant church, in his opinion, is in disarray. His goal is to centralize power, and he sees that there are 28 German bishops in 28 different states with 28 different traditions of independence, more or less. And how can you centralize? This is not a pretty picture for a dictator, so he proposes, of course, to reorganize these Protestant churches so that they all have one bishop, a Reich Church. He sees Henry VIII as his mentor in this case. Let's get a national church. And of course, that bishop will answer to him. Well, it's surprising in a way, and maybe not, given the force of the Nazi movement when it comes to power, that within months, just about all of those bishops are on board. They've signed up. Okay, let's have a centralized bishop, and we'll all answer to that bishop. Hitler has already chosen a bishop, except down there in the south, Bishop Meiser and Bishop Wurm say, not here. We love our Bavarian and Württemberg tradition. What's wrong with blue and white? We don't want to have a domination by Prussia. There was no theological issue here. They were just, not that they expressed, they said, we prefer our independence. Thank you very much. Now, of course, the regime wasn't taking this sitting down. They had their allies. They had the Reich bishop, they had the German Christian movement, and they had these local, regional Nazi leaders. The Gauleiter in Nuremberg was Julius Streicher, and all of his acolytes were there holding rallies, starting and reaching a peak really about the time of the Night of Long Knives, just building up down there through the streets of Nuremberg. You had them holding a rally. For example, the SA would come in singing "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," appropriating Protestant symbols. Over here, when the rally was in full force, you'd have Bishop Miser come into his churches over on the other side of the square, people emptying out and following him, saying "Heil Miser, the new hero." So basically there was a contest for mobilization, and this was of course not going the way that Hitler wanted, or the Reich Bishop. Hitler had put this in the hands of the Reich Bishop, who by arresting these bishops and putting them under house arrest in early October essentially recognizes that they're not going to be able to strip the bishop away from the people just by trying to propagandize them, because these bishops are pretty competent in mobilizing their own flocks, their own churches. They're faithful. So he throws them under house arrest, and he announces that they have two successors. Well, no one's ever heard of them. No one goes to their church. Instead, the congregations start holding church services outside of the window of the houses where these bishops are arrested. It's quite a scene. There are a lot of different scenes. It's not against Hitler. The bishop is careful to say that Hitler would, of course, side with him if Hitler was called in. He's not. No one is saying. Everybody's saying Führer's on our side. Hitler, of course, wants to be removed from these controversial issues, so he's not eager to get involved. Meanwhile, the regional leaders are saying this is really getting out of hand as it escalates because of this house arrest. They say now that it's political. It's about a religious issue, but people are lining up. People are now feeling like they have to choose between their church and their party membership. And church members are saying, "Oh, go ahead, torture me. You can kill me. I'm a martyr. This is what I believe in. For 9 centuries, my family has been on this land, and we've been church people, and this is not going to change." And so obviously something has to change in the opinion of the Führer. Hitler is reluctant to do it, but he moves to release the bishops from their house arrest, and he reinstates them in their district. Another point that I want to make moving forward a number of years to approach of war and the beginning of war is that even if there is a situation where there's not a political demonstration, you still have Hitler concerned about controlling the people when they're moving in masses according to what they perceive to be their own self-interest or following their own traditions of family or religion primarily. And the cases we're looking at here are in September of 1938 and September of 1939. What happens in September of 1938 is that in the Sudetenland crisis, in the shadow of this crisis, people along the border of France, on the western border of Germany, they become afraid that they'll be right in the way of the French armies as they pour across the border. Their communities and residences will be in the way. So these people are packing up their suitcases, filling the roads, heading toward inland somewhere where they'll be out of the way of the French army. Hundreds of thousands, up to 500,000 in these September days. And the military leaders, Jodl included, come and say, why don't you regulate this? We have no way of planning. What if we have a military operation? The roads are filled. We won't be able to move in. We won't be able to stage a battle. We can't plan. And Hitler has lots of reasons to follow them. First of all, if hundreds of thousands of Germans are on the move, he's the movement leader. Why isn't he in advance of that? And secondly, why are they doing it without him? Of course, the regime doesn't know who's moving exactly. They don't know where they're going. In addition, German propaganda is that it's those French who are chaotic. The Germans know how to line up behind a leader. The Germans know how to act collectively, and they'll stand and fight. Despite all of these reasons for following the military leaders who are saying this is a matter of military strategy, Hitler does not issue regulations to capture and regulate this flow of refugees in 1938. The same thing happens in 1939 initially. Now, a little bit later, Hitler does issue regulations, but they're not really enforced. Now, a third point here that I want to make about Hitler's compromise relative to his special relationship to the Germans is that he's willing to make compromises even into the later months of the war. That is, it's not just that he's paying attention to these eruptions of masses, to ingratiating the regime to the masses before war, but that continues during the war. Now, a major reason for this is his fear of another stab in the back. You all know what the stab in the back is, right? Well, the stab in the back is Hitler's vain excuse for why Germany lost the war in the First World War, that it wasn't the military, it was really the home front who were set astray by Judaism and Bolshevism. And if the home front had only remained strong and united, of course Germany would have won. Well, this is a false memory that had a huge impression on Hitler. Apparently he really believed it, internalized it, and acted on it. And it simply means that the entry of the United States into the war, for example, would make no difference. And Hitler seems to have carried this into World War II, focused on the fact that as long as there's not a home front stab in the back, we're doing okay. We're holding our line. And another thing that made him reluctant, I think, to say that Germany was losing was the fact that it's his role, he thought, to make every German believe that Germany was winning the war. Now, it's hard to know what Hitler thought personally, but he was certainly telling people that Germany was going to win. And the fact that he's, as we'll see, making compromises and safeguarding compromises into October 1944 might indicate that maybe he believes what he's saying, or at least he doesn't have another game to play other than to keep trying to get the people to put all of themselves up to giving their lives, whether it comes to house fighting or whatever, for the regime. So I submit, despite some opinion that's quite well established, that Hitler did not think that he could prevent a stab in the back by using force and terror alone, intimidation and terror alone. For one thing, we have this evidence of compromises. Also, we have the evidence that Hitler, from the beginning, from 1933, was trying to get people involved in National Socialism. It wasn't just a matter of repressing dissent. It was a matter of generating energy from below so that dissent would become more popular. Get involved in the stew Sundays. Do everything else when people do it like they do it. If you're a woman, get involved in the Frauenbund and so forth. Make it part of your everyday life. So it was never Hitler's goal simply to repress, and of course during the war, for Hitler, it's a much more sensitive time for repressing dissent, and that's why in September, in the early days of the war, Hitler bans all provocative measures against the churches that are unnecessarily provocative. As it turns out, Bormann and Heydrich talked him into some more repressive measures once the war is going well. The confiscation of, after Poland and France and so forth. Which brings us to a second point, and I submit that the regime felt it had more currency to use force when it was living up to its vaunted expectations, living up to the image that it claimed for itself, than when it was losing its war, which is a rather a reversal of an accepted opinion that as the war wore on, more violence, instrumental force was used to control the Germans. Now, that's certainly true in some cases, some agencies. I'm just talking about a focus on Hitler and the people as they are acting on behalf or in response to their traditions. So this is we can't overestimate what this is about. It's just about this Hitler dealing with the home front. But there is some evidence of this in the statement by Joseph Goebbels, for example, in August of 1940. Goebbels says to his Gauleiters, "We've been hanging back, but we need now, in the fullness of this victory, which has covered the Fuhrer with glory, the party, now we can act more forcibly against the church." And the case Goebbels mentions is that the church is stealing the glory from the regime and the party. Whenever there are soldiers who fall in battle, the churches really gear up and use it for their own propaganda. They begin proselytizing, and he says, these men haven't died for the church, they've died for the state. And we need, and do what you have to do now. We haven't been doing that, but in this moment of glory, we can be forcible now in preventing that. There's another example that shows this principle, which I think can be argued on other bases, but another specific statement. In August of 1941, we have the question about what to do with Bishop von Galen. Galen has stood at his pulpit and condemned euthanasia. The regime has denied that there is such a thing as Nazi euthanasia. Those who were earlier being sterilized are now being murdered. And Galen at the pulpit lends legitimacy to all those rumors, all those poor people who thought maybe they were wrong, trying to find a leg to stand on in the face of regime denials. So Galen is a huge figure of problematic opposition there. Now, what are you going to do with him? The question about whether Galen mobilized opinion in such a way that Hitler ordered a change to the euthanasia, I'm not going to deal with. That's another level of compromise. Here we're dealing only with a compromise about whether you punish the people who are the protesters. Goebbels said, well, we can't punish this bishop because it'll write off all of his whole section of people. They're not going to be working for the war anymore. They'll be dropping out, and we'll be paying for it. But the Gauleiter in Galen's region, Alfred Meyer, says, no, wait a minute, we can do that. Wait until there's a big victory, and while all of this is resounding across the Reich and people are on the same page behind the Fuhrer, we can hang that bishop and people will say it's a small price to pay, it's the cost of business. And we'll move on from there and we'll get our job done. Well, Hitler didn't agree, he put it off until after the war. I want to talk about just one more incident that brings us up to October of 1944. And that is the attempt by the regime to evacuate all civilians who were in the cities targeted by the Allied Air Force. The attempt by the regime to save its resources under fire included taking all of these civilians who were not involved in the armaments production in these cities in the Ruhr, closest to the bombing areas that the Allies could reach, and sending them off to the country. And the Ruhr area was like Baden-Baden. So millions of Germans were taken to the countrysides where the bombs weren't falling. Now the problem was that millions of them began to return. There was a huge back and forth. People started to treat it like they had two homes. I mean, we shouldn't make light of the difficult situations that the Germans had then, but they were moving back and forth, tying up trains. They were actually called wild evacuees. This was a term that, if you were labeled as wild in the Nazi parlance, that meant trouble. That meant you weren't really in line on the page with everybody else. They were also called Volksschädlinge, in the press. That's a term that, as an expression goes, it makes your head shorter if you're actually convicted of that. But that is people who are actually undermining the folk and the mission of the folk. So they certainly knew that they were problems. And the Gauleiters in their separate region, these regional party managers, were each given the mandate to manage these evacuations. Hitler said, on the one hand, evacuate everyone who is in the way of these bombs, who doesn't need to be there. And on the other hand, by the way, it should be voluntary. If there's a disagreement with me, you should talk them into it, educate. That's the tool. So when this happened, Gauleiter in Westphalia South had an idea. He said, well, let me distribute food rations only in the places where the people are evacuated to. That way they'll stay there. They won't get their rations over here when they come back to see their husbands in the towns that are being bombed. This immediately led to demonstrations and uprisings, basic nonconformity and rebellion. In Witten, on Hitler Square, it was rather organized, apparently, and very disciplined. Basically, the SD has the secret police has a detailed report on this, and they said the women did this in order to force the regime to meet their demands. Mince no words. It was absolutely true. So did that work? Well, whether to use this method continued to be a debate among Gauleiters. Goebbels, in November of 1943, muses on this in his diary. He says, the people have found the weak spot of the regime and they're exploiting it. The regime should never give in against its better insights to the power of the streets. He uses that word, the streets, because when it does, it loses power, and every time it does, it loses more power until the end it won't have any power. It's surprising then when he goes to Hitler in January and says, Führer, we need a decision. All these Gauleiters are fighting about what to do. Hitler says it's not an appropriate method. Even the soft means of coercion is off the table. And what is interesting here, that in order to prevent any further unrest and demonstrations, this order by Hitler using the same language, that this is not an appropriate means, manipulating the food rations, it's not an appropriate means, is reiterated by Bormann, his personal secretary, and by Himmler in July and October of 1944. He's still worried about preempting more of these actions like happened in October of 1943. Well, in closing, I want to say that it's important to keep all of this in context. It sounds like a good story, but of course all of this never came close to undermining Hitler's capacity to rule. Nothing did. Certainly not the 28th of July either, I submit. The conspiracy against Hitler. Military force from the outside was necessary. However, we do see another side here to Hitler's charismatic power, that he not only had to make these great deeds to draw the people toward him, he also used compromise and not just terror in order to so that he could maintain the prestige that he got, so it wouldn't be subtracted from and detracted from with scenes of dissent. And we see that this is happening all the way through 1944, that he continues to keep the folk in mind, trying to lead them across the dance floor to his folks' Gemeinschaft. Thank you.
Very illuminating talk. I would say we now step to the panel, and I would like to ask Professor Weinberg and Professor Jarausch and Nathan Stoltzfus, of course, please. Professor Weinberg, if you go to the right there. You in the middle. You're in the middle. Konrad here. I'll move the microphone so that people actually can hear us later. And I'll come here. Thank you. I hope that will be fine. Before I ask you, Professor Weinberg, to start the interrogation, let me ask Nathan, thank you again for a very illuminating talk. But as I said in my introduction, you have written and published several books on the Nazi era, on Hitler and other figures in the Nazi regime already. So why are you about to publish yet another book on Hitler? Isn't there any other topic in the world you would like to look at?
It's an excellent talk. Question. I've asked myself that repeatedly. And in fact, how did it happen that I go around talking about Hitler? This is a question that some of my friends date back to graduate school and the fateful decision. But as I mentioned, I think to you, that I did briefly after my first book on Nazi Germany, I made a foray into East German history. I was going to go to another dictatorship, a little bit lighter, and it turned out. Dictatorship? Yes, of course. Still, it wasn't like driving cultures or this kind of thing. It was still a dictatorship. There are many things to do. I was surprised, though, when somebody told me, a serious historian, that East German history just isn't as important as Nazi history. Now, I didn't agree with that. I think it depends what a historian brings to it. But I'd love to move on from Hitler. It happens that it's kind of a vortex that you generate opportunities that seem to be the kind of things you want. I've just been asked to write a book on Nazi perpetrators, and it seems interesting, like I could just do that, but it does hold me back. However, I do have another project, I'm glad to say, that involves Italy, Greece, and Germany, not only during World War II, but the memory since then.
Okay, thanks very much, but you obviously can't get away from the Nazis. Professor Weinberg, would you like to start questioning?
Well, I think your concept that this is an operator who's being careful to maintain control by making adjustments where they are needed. There are a couple of aspects of this that I think need a little further thought and comment. In August of 1941, officially the euthanasia program is halted. The reality is that it is simply decentralized. Those who've been running it are sent east to slaughter Jews systematically. And in the subsequent years, more Germans are killed in the euthanasia program than before August 41. By the middle of World War II, they're slaughtering disabled World War I veterans. And by the latter part of the war, they're beginning to slaughter disabled German World War II veterans. And this has become so routinized in the hospitals in Germany that only after they hear rumors of this do occupation authorities, after the German surrender, physically have to go into the hospitals to stop them from slaughtering their patients. At first, when the Americans and Brits hear about this, they don't believe it. They have this crazy notion that a hospital is a place where patients are cared for, not intentionally murdered. They discover in 1945 that this, and that's what I think is so interesting here, that this has become so much a routine part of what you do in a hospital. You kill certain categories of patients, that they're continuing to do it after the German surrender in May of 45. There is, in other words, a consistency which goes beyond, I would argue, the compromises. You mentioned some examples about bishops. We know from a very good book on the subject that all plans for the reconstruction of German cities after the war and for new settlements in the East, no space whatever was to be allocated for churches. The long-term aim, in other words, remains the same, though here, there, and the other place, when it comes to individuals of mixed Jewish so-called Aryan ancestry, lots of other places, the concern about home front morale is critical. But on the one hand, this in no way reduces the aims or practices of the regime. And there is another side to this that I would suggest is worth investigating. As people see that demonstrations, arguments, rumors of dissatisfaction can bring changes in policy, it is worth looking at the other side of this. The things that happen that don't produce any uproar, and where one needs to take another look. You mentioned the killings of June 30th, 1934. Included among those murdered at that point on Hitler's order is his predecessor as chancellor together with his wife. I would like for you to think about this. Hitler and Roosevelt come to positions of power a few weeks apart. What do you think would have been the reaction in this country in the summer of 1934 if Roosevelt had had Herbert Hoover, his predecessor, together with Mrs. Hoover, shot? No charges, no trial, nothing. There is no uproar in Germany about this. That much we know. And to take just one other example, which seems to me tells us something about not all, but lots of people prepared to go along with extraordinary things. The German term for a house, any house of worship of any religion, is a Gotteshaus, a house of God. In November of 1938, several hundred houses of God are burned, wrecked, destroyed. There's no uproar. There are no demonstrations. And neither the Catholic nor the Protestant leadership has anything to say about the destruction. And what I think is particularly intriguing in this regard is that the German press is instructed to print pictures of the destruction. The regime is proud of what it is doing, that everybody who didn't get to see it in person could see it in the local newspaper. There are no demonstrations. There is no sense of, we may hate the French, and we certainly don't care for the Poles, but what have we got against God? To burn down God's houses? The question does not arise. In other words, the very fact that you're quite right, in my opinion, that there are compromises made, on the one hand, in no way alters the aims of the regime, and on the other hand, tells us something about those outrageous things which don't produce any negative reaction on any substantial scale that at least is registered by those in charge.
Thank you. Nathan, would you like to comment on this?
Oh, just
no, you have the microphone.
Okay, just briefly. I agree entirely, of course, that nothing changed about the ideology, that the goals were always ideologically, dogmatically fixed. It was only a matter of maneuvering in order to get there. I certainly don't see resistance everywhere. It's very hard to find these cases, and no one has really paid that much attention to them. So I'm trying to talk about them as part of the story. It's impossible to tell the whole story of the regime in one book or one talk. We have a piece of it, we put it out there, we try to put it in context, and no one would agree more than I that there was not much protest. It's not detracting from what happens when there is protest, how the regime responds. Now, a question that you raise, it's very interesting, it would only be able to be addressed with speculation, is if protest had reached a more higher level, if it happened more often, would the regime have then repressed it? Was it happening in such a minimal quantity that the regime could overlook it?
Thank you. Konrad Jarausch.
Yeah, let me shift the perspective a little bit and look from a project of comparative studies of mass dictatorship, and especially from the GDR that you mentioned a moment ago, where a lot of the new work is indeed no longer about coercion or physical terror, but where it is about so-called soft stabilizers, and where there is now research on a certain level of accommodation that is perhaps even some kind of limited negotiation between the regime and the population in order to keep the population on board. And I want to do that by hitting 4 C's. Words that start with C, I won't start singing, okay? You don't have to. The first is the particular character of the Nazi dictatorship compared to some other dictatorships. Some of our German colleagues have started to talk about a consensus dictatorship, namely having the majority of the population, not necessarily even in the last semi-free election, but certainly with Nazi successes behind the regime. And that's a different situation from a communist dictatorship after 1945 in Eastern Europe, where it was only minorities who were in favor of it. Okay? So what you really have here, structurally speaking, is a considerable amount of agreement between large segments of the population and the Nazi party, ideology, leadership, and so on, whether we talk more about Hitler or not. So it seems to me, that is a kind of basic situation underneath it, and that creates a different kind of feeling even for the Nazi party, because since most of them knew that in most points the population that was not communist and not Jewish, and some social democrats and trade union leaders accepted, and so on, was behind the regime, then there is the possibility of creating some slack also, because it isn't quite as dangerous. The second C that I want to talk about is what you mentioned already, that Kershaw has talked about a lot, namely the charismatic nature of Hitler's leadership. And the question here is not just what does Hitler do, what does Goebbels do, how does the regime manipulate, but also how does the population work towards the Führer, which is one of the cliches, okay? And often even anticipate the Nazis, and in some of the instances, like the boycott of Jewish stores in 1933 and so on, we have examples where the Nazi leadership then has to sort of slow down the populace, which is already out there using violence and and doing criminal kind of actions. And what in the written version of your paper you stressed is, in my mind, an old imperial and Tsarist trope, namely, if only the Kaiser knew, or the Tsar knew, and so on. That is typical for stabilizing authoritarian regimes. When you're suffering locally, then you're hoping by appealing over the heads of the Gauleiter or whoever it is that is breathing down your neck and so on, then you can get out from under. Of course, it's an illusion which is strengthened by a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 symbolic act of liberality. Then the other 99 can stick. Okay, and so it actually works in favor of the regime. And another C that I want to briefly mention is the conundrum of complicity, because we have a whole range of responses from enthusiastic National Socialists through opportunists, through people who are doing mostly just their business or their duty, to people who are telling anti-Nazi jokes, but going and working in the munition factory anyway, all the way to people who are, somewhat resistant to outright opponents and so on. The last being a small minority, and of course the spectrum being skewed very much in favor of compliance. And it seems to me that we have to talk a little bit more specifically about what group we are meaning at any given moment, because the German people aren't just a blob. They may be, but they are subdivided into lots of different kinds of social classes and different religions and different political ideologies and so on. Therefore, what we need to know about is, who is non-compliant when, who dares to do something and who doesn't, who pulls in his tails and cowers, with the great majority, of course, doing the latter. And finally, in your talk, you've already given us a bunch of hints about change over time. It's the last C word, and so on. And you've been stressing, the success and the success creating latitude for the regime to do unpleasant things, because when you're successful, then the German proverb is "Wo gehobelt wird, fallen Späne." If you're planning a board, you're going to make some wood shavings and so on that are going to fall on the floor, and it's the business with the eggs and the omelets, and any different cultures have different rural ways or handicraft ways of expressing this. And so on. What interests me is really the crumbling part, towards the end, and you're somewhat in opposition to the Endkampf literature there, I think at some point or other the Nazis simply lose control over large parts of the population, because the Gauleiters themselves are, hoarding their petrol and getting their big cars ready to leave the East in front of the civilians. They go on record having a speech, holding fast, fighting to the last bullet against the Bolshevik hordes, and then they get into their car and they drive and stuff. And when that sort of begins to happen, there is a kind of fundamental rift of credibility and legitimacy, and at least some people, including, some highly placed Nazis, begin to think about life after Hitler. Is there such a thing? And so, in my mind, what is fascinating is at the end is this bifurcation between the bitter enders and not just the Kettenhunde of the SS and so on, but the people who are fighting and even committing suicide and stuff, and ever larger numbers of people who are beginning to disassociate themselves from the regime, and in which the regime then loses control. Now, all of this, just goes to a point which I think Gerhard has already made. I think in the Third Reich it was possible for the majority of the population to have a certain amount of Eigensinn, that is, stubbornness and self-will. As long as it went along with what the Nazis did, this was fine. And you're finding interesting instances in which they didn't quite go along, while yet not really being anti-Nazi. Okay? Because the final point is, what are the limitations of this limitation of power? And as Gerhard says, this limitation didn't prevent World War II, it didn't prevent war of annihilation, it didn't prevent ethnic cleansing, it did not prevent Holocaust.
Thank you. Plenty of questions for you. Up to you.
Oh, thank you very much. Nothing prevented all of these. It doesn't prevent us from studying whatever happened. I do want to also make room for studying this phenomenon without studying the motivations intensely of the protesters. It's just like studying denunciation without being sure of their motivations. We have all kinds of milieu studies about Catholics, but this has limits. The Hans Meiser story about the Reich Church has been studied, not a small amount, but it's been studied as church history. I'm interested in what happens when people go on the streets, when people protest. How does the regime respond? I'd rather not get too tied down in motivations. It's very important. It's extremely important. I just want to follow for a while what happens in this case, regardless of what motivates him. I'm not sure that I do run into problems with the end phase. I see it entirely the way that with violence decentralizing, people get to take violence when they want to. I'm just talking about Hitler in relationship to masses of the people who seem to be motivated by self-preservation instincts or by rituals they need to stay strong. And so this is a very limited part of the picture. And on the other hand, some of the end phase stories of terror, I wonder how representative they are. You can find cases where somebody is going through the bombed out building and steals an egg and gets executed for it. But I'm not sure how representative. They had to have very bad luck to have that happen, I think.
Thank you very much. So there was no chance, apart from the last year maybe, that the compromise policy which you mentioned in your talk was endangering the regime at all?
Oh, by no means. No, it wasn't.
It strengthens the regime.
Yeah. It strengthens the regime, that's the point. It's Hitler's way of living.
There is an aspect of the last part of the regime that I think is very important. You're quite right, Konrad, that people find ways out. But what is surely extraordinary is the extent to which they don't. And I don't think that in looking at that, we can simply disregard an important part of the regime's strategy in the last year of the war, which is strength through fear rather than strength through joy. The public knows in a general way that horrendous things have been done, and they are therefore terrified, and the regime does what it can to terrify them of the horrid things that are going to be done to them. And I would suggest that the single most revealing aspect of this is that when the regime eventually calls for massive local civilian resistance to the occupiers, the civilians don't do it. They know what the Germans have done to others when this happened. And they are terrified that if some local British or American or Russian or French Canadian soldier is killed, the town will be leveled. Exactly what they know their own soldiers have done in the past. And the regime's efforts to mobilize fail practically 99.9%. People with good reason mentioned the mayor of Aachen, big city in West Germany, who gets killed. But this is an incident, a sad one, but there is nothing of the sort of public resistance that the regime had asked for.
Thank you. Perhaps at this point we should open it to the audience, to questions from you. And you are very welcome to perhaps first address a few questions to Nathan, but Professor Weinberg, Professor Jarausch can of course be asked as well. Perhaps the gentleman here in white.
I have one question that you haven't seemed to discuss. What about the unholy alliance between the Vatican and the Nazi regime? Can you just discuss that a little bit?
Well, these popes did vary. The question is about the unholy alliance between the Nazis and the Vatican. I don't really specialize in that. The later Pope Pius XII, it's very controversial what he did and what he didn't do, and what he could have done. What specifically are you referring to? Which acts?
He was able to hold the people, Hitler held the people in check. He did whatever he said was okay, because the Catholic Church was protected.
Actually, Professor Weinberg is the expert on that.
Pope Pius XI, who died in early 39, had engaged, especially in the 1937 encyclical, the ideological incompatibility of National Socialism and Christianity. His successor, Pius XII, without going into large numbers of details, I would suggest there is some insight to be gathered from his pattern of behavior. From 1939 to 1945, he on several occasions publicly criticized the Allies for what they were doing. He would never, during those 6 years, find anything to criticize in what Nazi Germany was doing. And that, I think, suggests something about his view of issues. And there is one other thing which he did, which a British scholar discovered in the archives some years ago. As you probably know, in 1943, the Western Allies invade Italy, first Sicily and then the mainland of Italy, and are moving north. Pope Pius XII formally asks the, by this time, commander of all Allied forces, this is Sir Henry Maitland Wilson, who has succeeded Eisenhower, who was headed up north for the other job, to please not have any black soldiers in Rome. I do not believe that the accounts of the discussion in first British and then Allied headquarters was nearly as polite as the record suggests. One has to keep this in mind because obviously this was an initiative which Pius XII took and which the Allies flatly rejected after discussion, which, as I said, I don't think was as polite as the record indicates.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing this panel. Very interesting. I'll say right at the beginning, I grew up in Nazi Germany, and at the end of the war, can you all hear me? At the end of the war, 1945, I was 8, and the evacuation you mentioned in 1943, I remember that very, very well. We lived in Stuttgart, which was repeatedly bombed, and we were evacuated, and I have some good and bad memories of that. I'd like to come back to some of the things you said, particularly the Bishop of the state of Württemberg, Wulm. You mentioned him, and it was Meister in Bavaria. They worked very well together, and I have a couple of comments to make about Wulm. He was under house arrest in Stuttgart in 1934, and there were a group of courageous ministers who protested his arrest and succeeded, as you indicated, in releasing him. And one of the ministers who helped organize that was my father-in-law. Here's my wife. Her father's name is Otto Mülike, and Mülike was very influential, and he did a big favor to Wulm, his bishop, to get him out. Well, you mentioned a plebiscite, April the 10th, 1938, and they were really, the Germans were asked to give a vote there was one answer to two questions. The first one was, are you in favor of the annexation and, separated by a comma, in favor of the leadership of Adolf Hitler? So you could only give one answer. It was a big circle, and it was yes and a small no.
Yes.
Well, my father-in-law was one of the very few ministers who voted no, and that same night, stormtroopers crashed into the parsonage and dragged him out and nearly killed him right in the middle of the street. And as far as I know, I think that's true, as far as I know, he was the only minister. First of all, he was one of the very few ministers, Protestant, who voted against Hitler and against the annexation, who was physically attacked and put in jail. So the question was, what protection did he get from the Bishop of Württemberg? And he got zero protection. There were a few people in the city who were on his side, but they were scared to death to speak up in the protest. The SA was clearly in charge. Boom, the bishop had a duty. He was, by the way, rather anti-Semitic. He abandoned him. And then I'd like to come back to something, the euthanasia program. Von Galen was instrumental, but boom, had a change of mind, and he stuck his neck out.
Can I ask you, do you have a question?
Yeah, but I think it's important to say that my father-in-law was transferred to a village, and there he organized an effort to rescue Jews, and for that he became a righteous Gentile. So that was a good thing. The last thing I say, are you familiar with the name of Minister von Jan, Julius von Jan? You mentioned Kristallnacht, sir. You mentioned Kristallnacht. He was the only minister who gave a sermon against the destruction of the synagogues, and the same crowd that attacked my father-in-law attacked him, and he almost was killed. But there were some isolated protests. So
Thank you.
I don't really have a question, but it's a comment.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this personal impression. Thank you. Anyone who has got a question? Yes, this gentleman over there. I'll come to the microphone.
It's just that my friend in front had raised the question of the Vatican during the Nazi era, and not everybody, I think, has read John Cornwell's the Oxford historian's book on Hitler's Pope, which, because no mention was made by the fact that the Concordat in 1936 was actually signed by the future Pope Pius XII, or that most of the major Nazis were in fact Roman Catholics. The only one who was excommunicated was Goebbels, and he was excommunicated for marrying a Protestant. I wonder if you could elaborate on some of this. Also, the question of the Vatican and the escape route to South America of the Eichmanns and all the former SS, which went on for a long time after 1945.
Thank you. Any comments on this?
Well, just to say to both that I've read, and I haven't been able to see the archival sources on this, that there were two priests in Passau who didn't vote, and the churches made them make a public confession. In other words, it's not just the SA. This is the point, that they have, they have church support. By and large, these church leaders who are speaking out are also not making friends with their colleagues.
Thank you. Any more questions? Well, if there are no questions, you may wish to think about it.
What about the military? Besides June 1944, the plot to assassinate Hitler, were there any dissent in the military, and did Hitler make any compromises to quell that dissent?
Yes, I'm sure that.
There was a small but still substantial number of individuals in the German military who thought that Hitler was horrendous, who objected to his policies, not just that he was losing the war, but before he was losing the war, the horrendous treatment of Russian prisoners of war who were being killed or that died by the Germans the first 7 months of the campaign in the East at the rate of 10,000 a day, 7 days a week, for 7 months. Some of them were very much horrified by the killing of the Jews. And the first effort to kill Hitler by the military is in March of 43, when he visits headquarters of the German Army Group Center on the east. His opponents put a bomb into the airplane when he's heading back to his headquarters in East Prussia, and the bomb doesn't go off. In July 44, as I'm sure you all know, there is this coup attempt. But then two things happen which I think tell us a great deal about the subject. Because Hitler is not killed, but the conspirators in Berlin think he has been, because that's what the assassin has told them. All German commanders get 2 sets of instructions over their teletype machines on the same day. They get a set of instructions from the conspirators in Berlin, and they get a set of instructions from Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The commander in Paris, General von Stumpfnagel, is the only one who follows the orders from Berlin. In what I suppose was the last election in Germany, every other German military commander votes for his beloved Führer. And that may be influenced by something that then follows. Influences what follows. The top ones have all been accepting secret tax-free bribes from their beloved leader. And a court is set up to judge any who are accused of being decent. The head of the court is Field Marshal Rundstedt. The second judge is the new Army Chief of Staff, General Guderian, and then there is a third general by the name of Schröder. In this court, while they are sitting as judges, Rundstedt and Guderian are regularly accepting secret bribes from the prosecution. The accused are not allowed to defend themselves or to be represented. And this farce is called the Ehrenhof der Deutschen Wehrmacht, the Court of Honor of the German Armed Forces. A court of honor in which 2 of the 3 judges are accepting bribes from the prosecution, and there is no defense. I think that tells us something, not just about what happens to the military former comrades of these judges who are going to be sent off so that another court can sentence them to death, but it tells us something about a complete inversion of moral standards. That's what honor is. It's when you accept secret bribes from the prosecution as a judge, but don't allow for a defense.
Thank you. There's a chance for a final question. Otherwise, I will ask a final question. And as you know, the Nazi period burdened German history ever since. Throughout the Cold War, West Germany in particular, but also East Germany, were hugely burdened by Hitler and his crimes. Has that now been resolved? Has that been overcome with unification, with a certain passing of time, 70 years after the Nazi regime collapsed? What have been the changes in the meantime? How is West German and East German and United German history still burdened by the legacy
of the Nazi crimes, and in what way have these crimes been in some way overcome, been dealt with, been tackled with? Maybe Nathan Stoltzfus first.
Could I defer to Professor Jarausch? I was about to say, ask me something easier, but then I knew that
there are no easy questions
Jarausch could do this.
Okay. Konrad.
Well, I think that is the subject for another evening because it can't be done in one or two sentences. I think the long German complicated word is Vergangenheitsbewältigung. That deals with German efforts to cope with their past, some of them self-critical, some of them sweeping things under the rug. If you compared it to Italy or to Japan, then the Germans have done much more. If you compare it to what they ought to have done, then they have done much less. Especially on the legal level, it took semi-forever for the investigating arm after the Ulm trial to get established in the early 1960s, when a lot of the horses were already out of the barn. It's a metaphor one shouldn't use for Nazi perpetrators, and so on. So what we have is a kind of a competitive history between East Germany and West Germany, where both try to be the better Germany, and the East Germans have a kind of blanket denazification in which they say the industrialists and the big landowners are guilty for having helped Hitler into office, therefore we will take all of their possessions away. End of story. The West tries this on an individual level, according to standards which Gerhard just strongly defended as the only decent ones, in a legal way in which you have to show that an individual has committed war crimes or crimes against humanity. And unfortunately, too few people were tried. But in the cases that were done, the public record was constructed. That is, documents were collected and saved, and in the Berlin Document Center housed for a while under American control. And for the press, for publicists, and so on, and for intellectuals, and so on, sources were assembled, which then eventually got into the media in the 1960s, and then there's a gradual 2 or 3 generation process. It takes a long time to change a kind of personal family memory which says the regime was awful because it lost the war and it destroyed us and we had to flee from the East and stuff, but my grandfather was not bad. That kind of a family sort of recollection and public memory, to change that into a kind of memory, a political one, a collective one that is out there, in which presidents of the republic, chancellors apologize and so on, and in which there's some restitutions paid to the State of Israel and Jewish organization, once again not enough, and under demeaning circumstances, often in terms of creating records and so on. So that all I think one can say is that there has been a change over time in 2 or 3 generations towards a critical self-image of the Germans, although this doesn't cover all the skinheads and stuff like this, and that it's been a very messy and incomplete process because it's been a contentious social process in which personal evasion and personal memories clash with historical records, with intellectual indictments in which some of the German Nobel Prize winners of literature, like Heinrich Böll or Günter Grass, and so on, have held their compatriots to critical standards. I think this is a very feeble effort to sort of at least suggest a few of the dimensions of an answer.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask you a quick follow-up question. Currently, when we look at the world scene, there's actually pressure on the Angela Merkel government to do more in foreign policy, also to send German troops abroad in an increasingly stronger way, and to be a leader on the world scene. Does that indicate that the international community has clearly forgiven the Germans, and that the Germans, the United Germans, are really regarded as something unburdened from the Nazi past? Or Is that not a correct interpretation?
I wouldn't go quite that far. There are practical foreign policy reasons to want Germans to be more involved in various international crises, but there is, also an Anglo-American or international memory, and I think your presence tonight testifies to the continuing preoccupation with this. And I think we have there rather a gap between intellectuals who think of things German, by and large in relationship to the Third Reich, and not as much about all the changes which have happened in the last 3 generations, and policymakers who are in concrete practical situations which look at a big country that is once again in the center of Europe, has the biggest European economy, and they say, why are they hiding? And on balance, I would be in favor of them continue to hide. Or at least, maybe not hide, but to be reluctant, because when you have Balkan wars, there are strong memories of the Wehrmacht and stuff. Okay, in Afghanistan, maybe, there are sort of hazy remembrances of the Kaiser and some competition with the British and the Russians and stuff. But there are not very many German uniformed folks, that trampled, other folks underfoot and so on. So it also really depends upon the area, in which you're talking about. And I think in some ways the tension, that is the emphasis of the academic community and of the intellectuals on the critical recollection of German crimes, and the policy community and its needs for concrete leadership by the Germans, I think in some ways is healthy, because it keeps the Germans from doing nasty things to their neighbors. I mean, there are different Germans now. They're no longer the same ones, and often the children of Nazi perpetrators are the most vehement anti-Nazis and so on. But, it's better to be using soft power and persuasion and maybe a bit of money and so on, and multilateralism in order to get your way, than it is to bark at people and to tell them to go and line up against the wall.
Thanks very much. And of course, we should mention the embeddedness of European structures in the complex institutions of the European Union. But can Germany, the United Germany, really behave like Switzerland in foreign affairs? Konrad? Gerhard, I'm sorry.
No, I agree entirely with what Professor Jarausch just said, but I would add 2 very important elements to this. One of them is at the top and the other at the bottom. Konrad Adenauer, the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic, led the country in a direction and set, if you will, a symbolic role that was of critical importance. And he could do it without being attacked for being just an opportunist, because back in the years after the First World War, Adenauer had already argued for a reconciliation with France, which was about as unpopular a line as you could possibly take in the Germany of the 1920s. Just as de Gaulle was in a good position to reconcile with the Germans, nobody could attack him for being a collaborator in World War II. So Adenauer could honestly be a leader in a new direction. I'm not saying nasty things about his successors as Chancellor, but I think that his chancellorship has a great deal to do with what also now I would argue is needed, a look at the bottom. In Europe, unlike East Asia, there is what I would call a public reconciliation. The public in Europe, even in those countries where things were worse, Poland, former Soviet Union, that last winter in Holland, everyone I know in Germany who has traveled there always tells me all the people are friendly and hopeful. The hatreds are simply not there on the mass basis anymore. There is a mass reconciliation. And I mention it because it's so strikingly different in East Asia, where the failure and refusal of the Japanese to face up to their past has in some instances left good government relations, but retains the public hatreds. And when I alluded to this in '97 in a talk at their National Institute for Defense Studies, their combined West Point, Annapolis, and Air Force Academy, two young faculty members came up to me afterwards and said, "We know exactly what you are talking about. When we go as tourists to Seoul, the capital of Korea, or Manila, the capital of the Philippines, we do not dare chat with each other on the sidewalk in Japanese for fear of being physically assaulted." And when some years later I mentioned this at a lunch break in a seminar in Chicago, a lady who was eating with us said, "Oh, 2 years ago my husband and I were in Seoul. Two young Japanese women who were wives of American officers were being beaten on by a bunch of people on the sidewalk. They had not been warned not to talk Japanese, and we had to pull the people beating them up off them and shove these two ladies into a taxi." And when afterwards I asked the lady who had been there and with her husband had helped to support these two, to describe what she thought were roughly the ages of the people involved, it was perfectly obvious that there wasn't anybody involved in this who was born before 1945. The hatreds are passed from generation to generation here in the East, and they are not being passed by the vast majority of ordinary people from generation to generation in Europe.
Thank you very much indeed. Nathan, I think the last comment should be yours. Please give us your impression and the answers to the questions asked, and you have the final word.
Oh, thank you very much. I can't add or detract from this very fine question and the answers. I only wanted to ask maybe ask a question actually as to, isn't it true that economists, a very different set of people from these policymakers, do recognize that Germany has that inflation in its background, and thus it's can be overlooked when it asks for austerity. I do see that in the public press, the intellectual public press here in this country, more than I see that discussed by policymakers. Why doesn't Germany join us? An awareness of the sensitivity of the issue seems to be more missing in the political alignment.
Germany as a Switzerland in foreign affairs. Do you want to address that briefly?
Impossible.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Let me thank Nathan and Professor Jarausch, Professor Weinberg. Thank you very much for coming today in such large numbers. I would like to point out our next exciting event on the 29th of January, which is a Thursday. At that time, we will talk about Latin American relations, and the talk is by Steve Ray, is entitled "Torture, Murder, Genocide, American Latin American Relations." 29th of January.
What is the